So without further ado, we will jump into the healing power of stillness. I first want to say a huge welcome to those of you who are joining us online, especially those of you from Washington State in the United States. This event this evening is hosted by the First Church of Christ Scientist from Lakewood, Washington. So a huge thank you to all of the members of Lakewood, Washington that have sponsored this event this evening. I also want to welcome those of you who are listening on the phone. I know some of you have joined us by phone, and that's great. There are phone numbers to call if you'd like to have just an audio experience. So thank you for joining us by audio, by phone, and by and online. We'll start off this talk today with a story that takes us back to 1992. And it brings us to Sarajevo, across the ocean. And it's the story of a cellist. He, at one point, comes into the center square of Sarajevo with his cello, and he sits down amongst a lot of debris and rubble, and he starts to play his cello. And as the sounds of this beautiful instrument fill the square behind him, in the background, there are artillery shells falling on buildings, and people are taking cover in their homes because it's the start of the Bosnian Civil War. Now, this man didn't just come and play his cello randomly one particular afternoon. Excuse me, but he came back for 22 consecutive days to different spots in Sarajevo, in his beloved city. And he played his cello for 22 days straight in the middle of this war zone. He did this to commemorate the 22 men, women, and children that were killed at the start of the war while waiting in a bread line. Now, this story for me has been a great source of inspiration because to me, what it says is that no matter what might be bombarding us, outside of us, around us, it calls on myself and it calls us to ask that question, can we be in the middle of what may seem like a really difficult or conflictual or divisive or explosive situation? Hopefully not physically in a war zone, but maybe in a sense of conflict in life, or grappling with world events, or dealing with just thoughts that are going on in our own lives about our situations with finances, with career, with family, or maybe in relationships. But whatever it is that we might be feeling bombard us in our thinking on a daily basis, can we, like this cellist, bring what we have to offer and come from a place of deep settled calm to bring that stillness to whatever might be going on around us? Now, there's a great analogy. You should see a picture of a cello on your screen now. Excuse me. That I really like to think about when I think about stillness. And this talk today on the concept of stillness comes from my lifelong practice of Christian Science, the science of Christianity. And those two words, Christian and science, you may not have heard a lot together before if you're new to this concept, or maybe some of you have heard it a lot before. But when I think about Christianity and following in the footsteps of what Jesus taught, and I couple it with science, what it means to me is this sense of putting into practice and living out in life the essential ideas that are at the heart of Christianity, the heart of what Jesus was teaching. And that what that does is it helps us to grow spiritually and grow closer to God. Now, this analogy of stillness based on the cello is one that has helped me throughout different times in my life when I'm just tempted to react or tempted to feel dismayed by some particular situation or something someone else might have done, or something that I might have heard going on in the world. And if you look at the image on your screen, you'll see on the cello that there are these little knobs on the bottom, and those are the fine tuning knobs. And when I was going into cello lessons with my son over many, many years, the first thing he would do in his lessons would be to tune his instrument. And inevitably, when he would start to play a note in his lesson, his cello would be slightly out of tune. So his teacher would turn on a tuner, which has a pure, perfect tone that's being played. And then my son would start to play the same note on his instrument. And at first, when it's out of sync, you could hear this sort of vibration sound that tells you that it's not quite in sync with that pure, perfect tone. And then as he fine-tunes the instrument on those little knobs at the bottom, slowly, incrementally, the instrument comes right in line with that pure, perfect tone. And at that moment, if I would close my eyes in the lesson, it sounded like there was only one tone being played. And I like to think about this as the experience for me of stillness, that when I'm so attuned to listening for the voice from God, for the ideas that come directly from God, and I'm tuned into that divine presence, that divine goodness, then it feels less like I'm this individual out here in the world trying to figure things out all on my own. But it feels like it feels for me that we're really aligned directly with that divine presence, and that all of our activity comes directly from that divine presence and that place of deep settled calm. Now, there's a quote that I found from a woman named Pam Brown that I think gets at this idea. And she says, "At the center of the most turbulent heart, there is a place of peace, a place beyond time that cannot be touched by change or loss. No tumult can disturb the quietness. No shadow can dim the light. Here in this stillness is rest and healing. Nothing we suffer, nothing we fear can damage its perfection." Isn't that lovely? To me, it says that this sense of stillness is something that has within it all that's needed to find that deep settled sense of peace and calm. Now, often in my life and in friends of mine, there's this little feeling, this little suggestion, this little idea that will creep in that says, I would be much more at peace in life if fill in the blank. I could go back on vacation, if I could be in the mountains again, if my children would just go to sleep, if I could just figure out this financial challenge with our budget, et cetera, et cetera. If something would change in the government, if, et cetera. And while those thoughts sometimes those thoughts I think can creep in even without us fully noticing it, that we just have this underlying feeling that we'd be less stressed or less pressured if something would change outside of us. But the concept of stillness, which is aligning ourselves with the ideas that come from divine presence, means that there's nothing that has to change outside of us for us to find that deep settled calm. Now, it's beautiful to go to the mountains or to travel to some gorgeous faraway place. This week, I just spent the week, it's my children's break from school, and I was attending an event with my daughter and her Girl Scout troop up in northern Maine. And we were off the grid completely, no cell phone service, no Wi-Fi, totally away from everything for 3 days. And it was really lovely. And we were in the forest, in the snow, with our skis, with no one else around. And that peace and that quiet was just breathtaking. But as I was skiing and thinking about this talk today with you all, I was thinking about the real question of finding that same stillness and quiet that seems to be in that beautiful woods, and bringing it back in the midst of all the activity that we have during our day. And that's what this topic promises, that rather than having to escape to find divine love and divine goodness, that we can discover it right where we are, and that it is what gives us the power to and the inspiration to change what might need to change in our lives. So how do we find that? How do we tune ourselves into that divine voice? Well, we're helped by some ideas that are kind of keynote for our talk today. The first one is from Psalms in the Bible, and it says, "Be still and know that I am God." It's a clear directive, isn't it, from Psalms? For me, it's like a marching order. Here's what you're doing when you're being still, that you're knowing this divine presence that's right there. And to me, it sort of says that God is in charge, that I can just relax and settle into there being a divine order for every moment of the day. Now, in Christian Science, we have a companion book to the Bible. We read it alongside the Bible on a daily basis and study it on a daily basis. And one of the ideas that comes from it is this one: Spirit, or God, is heard when the senses are silent. That's written by Mary Baker Eddy, the founder of Christian Science, and you'll hear a little more about her in a bit. But this is the idea that we have to find that tuning in to God's voice, that the rest of our senses have to be quieted. And while, again, it's nice to do that in the middle of a beautiful mountain woods area, the challenge is to be able to do that right in the middle of whatever noise might be going on around us. That we quiet the noise by tuning in our thoughts, in consciousness, to that divine, ever-present message from God. Now, these are the two books we just talked about, the Bible and the Science and Health book, which is the key textbook on Christian Science that was discovered by Mary Baker Eddy in 1866 and talks about finding healing for all aspects of our lives. The ideas that you'll hear today come directly from my study of the Bible and the Christian Science textbook and the other writings by Mary Baker Eddy. And there's three parts today to what we're going to discuss. We're going to look at practicing stillness. So as you're thinking about your questions that you'd like to chat in or write in the question and answer box, we're going to talk about three applications of this idea of there being a deep settled calm in the stillness that is our divine conversation with God. And the first part we'll look at is, how do we practice this with ourselves? And then we'll look at sort of how it goes into relationships with others. And then finally, how do we look at world events from that place of stillness? And we'll really be asking the question, how can we remain undisturbed when it seems like there's so much going on around us that wants us to become very disturbed or pull us in to its drama? So those are the three parts that we'll be addressing today in our talk. So to start off, part one, peace with ourselves. Now, for me, this is really based on that keynote idea of being still and knowing that I am God. That there is something higher going on that we can rely on, that we can trust, that this divine presence is not just a nice idea out there that we can think about when we're in happy times. And it's not just an idea that we rely on when we're at our wits' end, although that's a great time to call on God. But it's really the sense that the presence of God is in every moment, that it comes in a moment by moment practice, not just when we're at our wits' end and we need something, or maybe when we're having everything go right and then we're thanking God, but really in every little thing. And to start off, to think about this, I'd like to just open up the chat box here, and I'm going to give you guys, everybody who's on the computer today, and I'll repeat what's being chatted for those of you that are on the phone so that you can participate as well. So in a moment here, you're going to see the chat box. If you look up, you'll be able to see right about now, there should be access to the chat box in your menu. So what we're going to do is, if you could just look and think for a moment for yourself, and then go ahead and find your chat box. And as you get an idea, go ahead and just chat it in. And I'll, again, repeat it for those that are not getting the visual at the moment. But what I'd like you to chat in is the answer to this question. What does it look like when you know that you are truly at peace? When you're experiencing that stillness with God, what does it look like for you? How do you know you've reached that place where you're really feeling a deep, settled sense of peace and calm? So go ahead and just chat in right there on the chat box, any of your answers, whatever it looks like for you. Anything at all, whatever characterizes that sense of being at peace for you. So the first person wrote, I feel shiny, like I'm shining. That's great. That reminds me, Shauna, of that sense of the light of the world, that being at peace, we're in tune with our deepest purpose, which is, as Jesus talked about, to be that light of the world in his Sermon on the Mount. Someone else wrote in that they feel really open. And what I love about that sense of being open, Inga, sorry about that, Inga, is really that when we're truly open, the reason that characterizes being at peace for me is because it means that we're not judging others, that we're not trying to categorize or compare one thing to another, compare others to how we're doing, or comparing ourselves to others, but we're really just feeling that sense of openness to the good that is existent in life, to the spiritual good that is always there and that we don't want to miss in our daily lives. Someone else chatted that really being at peace means to be undisturbed, to just not get all agitated and stuck in that kind of reactionary conflict that sometimes we can have with ourselves or with others, that we're truly not feeling disturbed by whatever might be going on around us. Someone else said that it's a feeling that all really is well. Not just a superficial sense of wellness, but that there's truly a sense that all will be well. Someone else said that there's a warm sense of comfort in being at peace, that there's no stress. In my, I teach Sunday school every Sunday. And since today is Sunday, I had my class today, and we were talking about this sense of stress and pressure. And they were talking about how to combat that in their lives, and how that finding that deep settled sense of being at peace and being really calm is a way to combat this idea of stress and pressure that often doesn't actually help accomplish the things that they need to accomplish anyway. And then finally, somebody said, an absence of fear, doubt, uncertainty, understanding a conviction of a loving, trusted presence. Thank you, Nancy, for that one. An absence of fear or doubt, that when we're truly at peace, we're not afraid. There's a sense of courageousness, or maybe of confidence, that we're willing to try new things or be open to spontaneity. All right, so on your screen now, there's a few things that we'll just add to the list. One thing, a couple of things for me that have really characterized that sense of stillness and peace is harmony, seeing that oneness with God. We talked about not judging others, but coming from a place of love. That being at peace is really about letting there be a sense of trust. And it allows us to let things happen rather than having to make them happen all the time. Rather than feeling like we're the ones in control that have to, really make everything happen, that there's a willingness to let things unfold as they're meant to be, to let things take their course, and to trust the goodness inherent in that. That peace is really about a sense of joy that's not tethered to outside circumstances necessarily. A joy that it's not joy because we just got a huge check in the mail, or we just finally finished that dissertation we'd been working on for 10 years, or, that our child finally learned how to, whatever milestone might be there, do their homework on their own, or whatever it might be. But the joy that, and those things may be a cause for joy, but that joy is there even when the check doesn't come in the mail, or the budget doesn't balance, or the child hasn't quite learned the lesson yet, that there's a joy in knowing that that goodness is constant. And even if right now there seems to be a momentary sort of break in that peace, the joy is what tells us that we can keep expecting to see the good that is inherently there as children of God, as children of that divine presence. We'll get into that a little more in a bit, but a couple other things, just that deep sense of calm, a deep settled sense of calm, and then also satisfaction. That being at peace means we have a right to wake up in the morning and be satisfied with the day before it even begins. All right, so now on the right, we're just gonna do another list here. So for those that aren't looking at the screen, we're just making two lists on the computer screen at the moment. The first one, again, was just what it means to be at peace. And the second list is really things in our life, places in our life where we're looking to find this sense of peace or stillness. Challenges to it, maybe, for example. So your chat should still be open. So go ahead, and if you'd like to, you can chat in just anything that you would really like to find a greater sense of peace and stillness about in life. Maybe it's a sense of career or jobs or finances or any number of things like family or relationships. It could be an issue of something going on in the world for you, something that really you feel like the world really needs to see peace about, that you would love to see a sense of calm and stillness to characterize this part of the world. So go ahead, if you're on the computer, and feel free to chat in any of your ideas about places in life where often we look for that sense of peace to be expressed, where we often are trying to find how we can see that peace and stillness right in the middle of what may seem to be a different view of things. So, and I'll just pull up here. Someone mentioned career. Yep, sort of that sense of purpose and your sense of where your path is headed. That's often one that we look for finding peace in. Health could be one that sometimes people are looking for. I'll go ahead and pull up the list here on the screen. We can kind of add to it if you have other things you'd like to add to the list. But a couple of them for me are just, relationships, finances, politics or government, career, which was mentioned, family, parenting, all kinds of world events, whether it's environment or government, busy schedules, stress, pressure, things like that. And then health is really the last one. So as we're thinking about this, oh, good. Thank you. Christine added one. She added that freedom from claims of age can be one of those things that we're looking to find that sense of peace and healing about. Thank you for that one, Christine. We should definitely add that to the list. Someone else mentioned that a concern can be refugees from strife-torn countries, from the places in the world that seem to be experiencing this conflict and challenge, that how can we know there's peace there when it looks like it's such a challenging situation of conflict? Someone else said praying for world leaders and righteous government that is fair and benevolent. Ooh, that's a great challenge for all of us, I think. And isn't that a place where we want to see stillness expressed, especially when we're looking sometimes at world leaders and we're wanting so badly to find an answer that will bring that righteous government and that fairness. All right, so we will thank you for some of those answers. I appreciate those additions where we're looking for peace. So now, as you look at these lists on the computer and thinking about the qualities on the left-hand side, harmony and love and free from judgment, a deep settled calm, a sense of joy. And then we look on the right and we think about the claims of age or war-torn countries and refugees, or a sense of world leaders and, or busy schedules, whatever it might be that we look to find peace in. As we look at these two different lists, often what happens, for me at least, or sometimes sort of an approach that we can take in prayer sometimes, is that we start off on the right-hand side with the challenge that needs to be healed, or needs to find a calm and a stillness. So whether it's career and finances, or the refugee crisis, or any number of challenges that we might be dealing with, sometimes we can kind of end up starting there and then trying to apply the things on the left-hand side, the harmony or the joy or the peace, that we can try to sort of start applying those things to the problem that we have on the right-hand side. And what I have found in my experience is that often it's very hard to get to the qualities on the left when I start with the things that are over there on the right, when I start with the challenge. And I'll tell you a little story, and this list we'll click off this list for a minute, but I'm just gonna pause the screen for a minute and just share a little story with you here that sort of, for me, illustrates this experience. And it was a healing that I had of a really pinched nerve and very stiff neck a few years ago. I had woken up right before Christmas and was expecting family and friends to come for the holidays. And I had a huge to-do list of all kinds of things to do. And I was trying to get through it. But when I woke up in the morning, and as I have been doing for most of my life, my first thoughts were really focused on prayer and listening to God. But this particular day, it was so uncomfortable, and I had not slept well, and I had sort of started thinking about how I hadn't slept well and how I had this stiff neck and I had so many things to do, and was having trouble turning my head. But my prayer was kind of rushed, and it was really sort of a plea a little bit to God to just kind of, help heal this situation so I could get on with my day and do so many things that I had to do. Well, needless to say, I went throughout my day. I went to bed that night late and didn't sleep well again. I woke up the next morning and was feeling even worse. And by the third morning, the pain from my upper shoulder area all the way through the back of my neck, the back of my head, was so excruciating that even just taking a step would send these shooting pains up the back of my neck. And I had no mobility whatsoever to turn my head left or right. So I literally had to be lying in bed. Now, this was Christmas Eve. I had people coming, as I said, and the last thing that I wanted to be doing was lying in bed. And yet I knew that my days and my prayers so far had not really been characterized so much by those qualities that we listed, not really been feeling that or thinking about or really focusing on that sense of joy or that sense of calm or the sense of harmony, that I had really been kind of focusing on what needed to be healed, what needed to be changed, what I wanted peace about, which was this health challenge. And I had been really trying to apply the ideas that I was reading in the Bible and the ideas in science and health to the challenge. But what happened is I was lying there in bed for hours, just really trying to reach out to God with my whole heart and just listen more carefully. And I had all these racing thoughts going on in my head, and was really working to calm those down. And what really helped was when I heard a very clear message kind of cut through all of those racing words that were going on and all the things I had to do. And the message was, I am the shepherd. Now, I wasn't sure exactly what that meant at first, but as I thought about this idea of the shepherd being God and me being a sheep, what happened is, at that moment, it turned right upside down this idea that I was the one in charge of everything, including feeling like I had to be in charge of finding the right thought to apply to this problem with my neck so that I could have this freedom in my body so that I could get on with my day. that as I realized that I wasn't in charge of any of that, and that in fact, what I had to do was to be like one of those sheep that it talks about in Psalms 23, that where the sheep are led to still waters and they're cared for by the shepherd, that as I needed to rest by those still waters, that all of the responsibility and the eagerness to plan everything perfectly, the need to feel in control, the need to feel in charge, the need to feel like I was going to get everything done correctly and right, just fell away. I realized I had been sort of thinking of God as like this divine assistant of mine, that prayer was like what tuned us into sort of how God would come and intervene in our lives and kind of help us out, fix our lives a little bit. But prayer in Christian Science is sort of the opposite of that. It's really aligning ourselves and our thought and our consciousness with what God has already accomplished for us. That what I needed to do was not find a way to get God to help me with what I needed to do, but that I needed to understand this spiritual concept of how the day that I wanted to have with my family, how it was already complete and already accomplished, and that I was sort of like the sheep following the shepherd who knew how everything was going to go. That I wasn't the mover and shaker in my life, that it was really about quieting all of those thoughts to be receptive to that divine conversation with God. And that line of thinking just took me in a completely new direction. To think that to have a successful Christmas, I didn't have to be the one in charge of everything was kind of this radical new concept, which I should have realized probably before, but it was one of those really revelatory moments where I just could feel the need to keep God at the center rather than feeling like I was at the center of my life and God was this peripheral divine help from time to time. So as I searched through the Bible and the Science and Health book that day, I found a really helpful idea that I'll just share with you here, and I'll put it up on the screen again. And it comes from Mary Baker Eddy, from her book, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. And she said this, she said, "The scientific unity which exists between God and man must be wrought out in life practice." Now, that's what I was understanding that day, was that there was this unity that was based on scientific principle, this divine principle that was based in God as that principle. That principle was divine creation as God created it and identified it. And that life is about understanding and practicing all of our activity based in that unity with God, that oneness with God. So in conclusion, in thinking about, before as we get to part 2 here, as we think about peace with ourselves, that some of the key elements for me were to start, rather than to start with this idea of how do we pray about the crisis of refugees around the world. Not that that's a bad thing to ask, or that I don't ask that myself, but that as we start with the basis of how can we see God in every situation in life, if there's no place or situation where that can be absent from the divine presence. And we reframe a question. For me, it's often about reframing a question that's based on that scientific unity, rather than based on the idea that there's some place that unity is not existent, and then we try to work up to the unity. That we frame our question for wanting to find peace in the world somewhere as if we already know that unity exists with God, that unity is present, that divine goodness is there, and that our desire is to see more of it, as opposed to understand why it's not there or try to figure it out. In other words, starting with that list that you saw on the left-hand side of your screen, starting with those qualities and looking to see those qualities in action. And what happened for me in my own healing of my physical body, of my neck and my shoulders, was that as I focused on that unity and being a receptive idea rather than at the center of life, that as I focused on the joy and the calm and the peace, I started to see those in my experience. I saw how that was what characterized that Christmas. I became free from all the pain that was in my neck as my thought shifted from thinking that I was at the center of this healing and this experience to really thinking about the way that this divine presence of God is what brings healing. And to understand the characteristics of what it meant to be truly that sheep, as following a divine shepherd, like in that 23rd Psalm. And as I did that, the tension freed up and I was able to move my head and I was able to go back and rejoin my family that Christmas. And for me, what that experience teaches is that it's not about the change that helps us find the stillness. It's about finding that stillness and discovering that it's right there that changes our experience. So starting with those qualities that shifts the things in our lives. All right, so getting on to looking a little bit at what does this mean when we are dealing with a relationship challenge. And again, feel free to, I will leave some time for questions and answers at the end, so feel free to chat in any questions that you might have during this talk. All right, so in part 2, relationships, and this is really based on this idea of being still and seeking God, really seeking out that divine presence in our lives and focusing on looking for that more than anything else. Now, Paul said something in his letters to the Philippians as he was traveling around and sharing Christianity. He talked about this, that each one of us has the same mind that was in Christ Jesus. And now there's an idea that has been really helpful about this and thinking about the mind of Christ. And so this is a great one too that we can make a list about, but for now, just make a list at home where you are on your notepad or in your thoughts about what it means to you to have the mind of Christ, like Paul was talking about. First of all, this idea of Christ, that in Christian Science, as Mary Baker Eddy defined Christ, she was really talking about the spirit that's timeless, that has existed throughout all eternity, and that's going to continue to exist for our children and grandchildren and so on. And that it's this based on this divine principle, this principle of goodness of God, and that we can rely on it. And just like when we wake up in the morning, we don't think to ourselves, gosh, I wonder if gravity's working today. We just get out of bed and we get dressed and we go about our day and we just trust that idea, that concept of gravity is working on our behalf. Well, Mary Baker Eddy talked about there being a divine spiritual principle that works like that. And that we understand it through this idea of the mind of Christ, through the messages that God gives to each of us, the little inspirations that come to consciousness directly from God. And that's what the Christ represents, is the connection and the receptivity to God's messages and divine ideas for us. For me, the mind of Christ means that we can let go of feeling in charge all the time, that we can think more broadly beyond ourselves, that we don't feel superior to anyone else, that we don't have to go through a problem and analyze every little thing about it in order to find healing, and that healing is always at hand. The stillness and peace we're looking for those challenges we addressed earlier, it's always at hand. It's not about something external changing, but something that is always right within us that we can find right in our present moment. Now, this part about not analyzing everything before we have to find healing, the way that the Christ works is that sometimes in those moments of stillness, when we've quieted the senses and are really tuning in to that unity with God, sometimes in my experience, it uncovers patterns of thinking that I'm ready to let go of. Maybe it's a resentment against somebody, or a feeling of inadequacy, or maybe it's just something that needs forgiveness that I was holding on to that happened long ago. And sometimes those things come to the surface in those moments of peace because they're ready to be let go of. But I have found, at least, that they don't often come through human analyzing, and that in fact it's counterproductive. That sometimes the analyzing to look for one of those, the root cause and the root problem, just digs us more into the challenge and the problem, rather than turning us more towards the ideal concept, the divine concept, that is what allows us to find and experience healing. So having the mind of Christ is key for addressing whatever might be going on in our relationships. So I have another story that I'll share with you, and it's a story from a friend of mine about 20 years ago. And she was working in her home one day. She was doing some cleaning and she dropped a glass and it shattered into a million little pieces. And one of the little tiny minuscule pieces got embedded in her eyeball. And it was quite uncomfortable, and she was in a lot of pain, and she was having trouble closing her eye, and she was having a lot of trouble seeing. And although she had been practicing these ideas from the Bible and from Christian Science that we've been talking about and applying them in her life, she was pretty nervous and fearful about her eyesight. And her husband was also quite afraid for her. And while he was not a very religious man, he appreciated her faith and wanted her to trust it, but he was also really concerned about her health and her eyesight. So they rushed off to the emergency room at the local hospital. When they got there, the doctors examined her eye and they could see the little piece of glass that had gotten somehow kind of embedded in her eyeball. And so they said they would need to do a small procedure to be able to get it out, and that they couldn't guarantee anything, but hopefully it would go smoothly. So she asked if she could just have a few moments to pray quietly and to take some time to herself. And they said, sure, yeah, take your time while we get ready for this procedure. So she walked out of the hospital and she made a phone call. And when she called and we talked for a few minutes, she asked if I would pray with her as a Christian Science practitioner of the healing method in Christian Science. And I said I would. And we just had time for one idea, to share one particular idea. And the idea that came really clearly was that she should go back into the hospital and just love everyone and everything that she saw. And as she walked back in, she started to feel all of the burden of the conflict she'd felt being there at the hospital, the concern she had about the procedure to get this out of her eye, her frustrations that she'd been having for a long time with her husband, et cetera, et cetera. All of that just fell away. And she had this overwhelming sense of love for the doctors and the nurses and all the patients and everyone she came in contact with in the hospital. Well, as that happened, she felt the piece of glass no longer in her eye. She felt it just fall out. She blinked and it was no longer there. And she went back in and she talked to the doctors and she said, I think the piece of glass has fallen out. And they looked at her again and they said, yeah, you're fine. Whatever you did, you've gotten it out without any problem. And your eyesight is great, looks fine. You can go home. But what was so poignant to her about this was that the calm sense and the love for others came before there was any resolution. Now, there's an idea from Mary Baker Eddy. I'll just pull up again here on the screen for you. And I think it really speaks to this concept of what it looks like to really just have that happen first, to really understand that when we are able to really get super calm, that other things resolve themselves. So Mary Baker Eddy wrote this. She said, there is a rest in Christ, a peace in love. The thought of it, the thought of it stills complaint. The heaving surf of life's troubled sea foams itself away, and underneath is a deep settled calm. Now, this sense of there being a peace in love, and that thinking of that stills the complaint. Whatever the complaint is, whether it's a complaint about someone else or a complaint in our own heart or a complaint about the way people are in our lives, whatever the complaint may be, that it calms it. And underneath is that deep settled calm. Now, there was an article in the Washington Post about a year or so ago, and there was a Harvard Medical School professor named Jeffrey Rediger who wrote a couple of interesting things in this article. He was talking about these concepts of health and how he was seeing in his medical practice that over 100 people that had medical evidence of incurable diseases were recovering without any medical intervention. And he said that for him, there was an identifiable sort of similarity in all of these experiences that were associated with their recoveries, and that they had something to do with mental and spiritual principles that we were just beginning to understand. Now, he was really calling on people reading the article to think about and to look at what's going on. Why aren't we studying these experiences where there's these recoveries from incurable illness rather than focusing so much on all of the diseases and problems? And what's interesting about this is that this is the same question that Mary Baker Eddy, similar question to what Mary Baker Eddy was asking over 100 years ago. When she discovered Christian Science in 1866, she spent the rest of her life really delving deeply into the Bible to understand how an experience that she had of recovering from something incurable could be replicated for others, and what the relationship was of understanding more about God that changed our relationships, that changed our experience with others, that changed our experience with ourselves and with health. She discovered a sense of God as being impartial, universal love, and that there was a unity with this divine presence that exists for every individual, regardless of religion, regardless of economic status, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of language or culture or geographical location. That this one principle that's based on divine presence is applicable in everyone's experience. And she had that experience and saw how it could be applied for so many others. And that's what she wrote about in her book, Science and Health. Now, in conclusion for part 2 here, which we covered quickly, as we think about my friend's healing of the glass in her eye, as related to her sort of tension, frustration with her husband and with others around her, that it was her decision to love that washed away the challenge before anyone else's behavior changed. And as we realize that we get our thoughts about other people directly from God, not from the way people behave, then we have a choice about how we see all of the relationships that we're in. All right, getting to the part 3 about the world. We're almost coming to the conclusion here. And again, feel free to chat in any of the questions that you would like addressed for the last few minutes of our talk. But thinking about how we can be at peace with the world, there's another passage in Psalms that talks about be still and commune with your own heart. And it really is talking about listening to being still and quiet and listening to what your own heart is saying. Now, there's a little analogy here that's helped me with this idea for a long time, and it's similar to the cellist in the square in the war zone in Sarajevo. But it was a contest for drawing what peace looks like, and it was for kids. It was years ago when I was working in peace building, and all these children submitted drawings of what they thought peace looked like. And the winning drawing was a picture of a huge, roaring, rushing waterfall that was very turbulent at the bottom and all stirred up. And if you've ever been to a waterfall like this, you know that it's a very turbulent, loud place. It's not a quiet place. You often have to shout for people to hear you if you're standing at the base of the waterfall. And on the ledge right behind the waterfall, there was a little yellow canary. And the canary was pictured as singing. And that was the image they chose to represent peace. And what this says to me is that it's that sense that someone texted in earlier about being undisturbed. That no matter what might be roaring or rushing around us, that stillness gives us an ability to remain undisturbed. That as we seek for those qualities on the left-hand side of that list that we made, and look for the peace and look for the love or the joy, right where it seems like despair would want to overwhelm us, that it starts us to glimpse the principle we've been talking about of spiritual good that's always present. Now, when I was whitewater rafting a couple of summers ago, a friend of mine taught me about the way to find stillness on the river. Maybe some of you have had this experience, but as you're going down the river on a raft, after you've just made it through a particularly tough rapid and you're paddling and trying to keep your boat afloat, that once you get through that, she would teach us to look for the eddies in the river. Now, an eddy is a place in the river that's usually behind a rock that's rooted in the bedrock of the river. And just upriver from that is usually a place that's fairly still, where the water might swirl slightly, but it's not affected by the current that's taking the river down, that's taking everything downriver. And if you steer your boat into that eddy, the current doesn't affect you. You can stay there and rest without your paddles and take a breather from paddling. And what I love about this is I really like to think about the Christian Science Monitor newspaper as kind of like one of these little eddies. Now, this is a newspaper. It's an online news source today that was founded by Mary Baker Eddy. It's not a religious publication, but it's based in spiritual ideas and concepts about the way that news should contribute to society, which is that it should contribute in a way that blesses and doesn't harm any individual. In a way, we can think of it in this context as a way that it contributes a little bit of that stillness to all the noise that's out there in the news. Now, I find that reading the Christian Science Monitor does this for me, that it helps me to find a stillness about all the clamoring of the news media, all the media that comes through Facebook or social media or online sources or other sources that I read where they're covering every detail of the day and the latest development in the world or in politics or whatever might be going on. But the Christian Science Monitor has this ability to give a little bit of an eddy, a little still place to really deeply consider where the good is in the situation. And I find that what happens then is that sometimes when there's a development in the world, it can feel like we're on that raft on the river, getting pulled by the current so quickly that before we know it, we're downriver in a terrible rapid, enmeshed in this rapid, getting swirled and tumbled so quickly with the current of thought that we're coming to conclusions that we don't even necessarily agree with, that the whole world is falling apart, that there's no solution, that it's hopeless, that until X changes or until something else shifts, well, there's just nothing we can do. And for me, the Christian Science Monitor is a tool that pulls us into an eddy on the river and says, be still and know that God is here. Communing with your own heart says to search your heart for what truly is going on and what we can contribute to the world. What I love about this idea is that it says that we can, and I'll just put up the questions portal now. So if you have any questions, this is your time to chat them in and we'll address them for a few minutes, but I'll just share a couple of ideas as we're sort of waiting for some questions to chat in. But one of the things that that really has helped me in thinking about finding those eddies in terms of world thought, in terms of just concepts of what's going on in the world, is to look for my understanding of the situation based on what I hear in the stillness rather than what I hear in the news media. And what I find is that in proportion as I spend time listening for that divine idea from God, that my concern or the challenge that I may have about a particular world issue seems to be lessened in proportion that I'm focusing on those ideas from God. And it kind of works the opposite way too, that when I'm really enmeshed in a particular story about what might be happening with a particular world issue, that the deeper I get into the details, the harder it is to identify how there's any solution at all possible. So that in proportion as we turn a little bit and tune into that sort of divine conversation that we talked about at the beginning, just tuning ourselves in sort of with those fine tuners of our lives to the conversation going on with God, that tends to quiet the noise going on around us. And that stillness is what allows us to really feel that ongoing divine presence. You know, when we think back to the analogy of the cello at the beginning, that a cello or an instrument inherently has an ability to be in tune. That's how it was created. If it was, created well, in the ideal concept of the instrument, that it was created to be in tune, to play perfectly tuned. But through usage and through travel from one temperature to another, or by putting it in the case and out of the case, that it gets bumped around a little bit, and it needs retuning regularly. And anyone who plays one of these instruments knows that there's no expectation that the instrument will stay in tune constantly. The expectation is that you get really good at tuning it, because every time you move around, it gets a little out of tune and you have to constantly retune. What I love about that is that stillness and the practice of Christian Science is kind of like that for me, that it's not about reaching a plateau of perfection that then says we can kind of rest there and just coast along. That it's about constant retuning in to what that divine principle is saying about life. All right, guys, I don't see any questions, so I'm just going to conclude here for a few moments. And if you have any at the end that you'd like to chat in, I'll stay on at the end for a few more minutes. If you have any questions you'd like to ask in the chat box, in case you want to pose any questions. But just in summary, to conclude, we'll just look over a couple of points that we talked about in summary. And the first one is that being still tunes us into that oneness with God that we talked about. That helps us so much think about our own lives and being at peace for ourselves. But the second idea is that as we look beyond the behavior of others, that we see others as the evidence of God expressed, that we look to God for our thoughts about others, not to the way that they behave. And then finally, that as we focus less on the world events in front of us, not ignoring them, but allowing ourselves to find a little bit of that eddy on the river of thought, that it helps us to hear the voice of God within consciousness, that it helps us to hear that and tune into that voice of love. Just like Mary Baker Eddy wrote about in her writings when she said that God that is love, that there's a scientific unity between God and each one of us. So in conclusion, I'll just share an idea written by Mary Baker Eddy. She said that mind revolves on a spiritual axis, and its power is displayed and its presence felt in eternal stillness and immovable love. All right, so thank you for joining this webinar today, this web lecture. And again, you should see that there's still a question and answer box. If you have anything that you didn't get answered that you'd like to continue talking about or posting any comments or anything, feel free. I'll stay on for a few more minutes for anyone that wants to post any comments or questions. But otherwise, I'll say thank you. And it was lovely to be with you wherever you were joining us from Washington or from other parts of the world. And have a wonderful evening or afternoon.